Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Poltergeist on DVD. They're here! Before I get into it, I just want to offer y'all a quick apology because I had meant to do this review long before now, but last week I came down with a stomach bug and I did not feel like doing anything. So I wanted to wait until I felt better and was better to take another shot at it. So here we are, and thanks for tuning in. And for those of you who continue to tune in, thank y'all very much. So let's get into what Poltergeist was. Poltergeist was a movie that came out in 1982, and it was directed by Tobe Hooper, and it was produced by Steven Spielberg and Frank Marshall. And Spielberg also came up with the story and co-wrote the screenplay, so in case you haven't figured it out by now, Steven Spielberg was heavily involved in this movie. Poltergeist was a critical and a financial success, and audiences loved it too. And just to give you an idea of how successful it was, it had a budget of somewhere between $10 and $11 million, but it made around $121 million at the box office, so it made a killing. And it was also nominated for 3 Oscars. You had Best Original Score by Jerry Goldsmith, Best Sound Effects Editing, and Best Visual Effects. And it ironically lost all 3 of those awards to E.T., the Extraterrestrial, which was another Spielberg-centric film. Go figure. But Poltergeist is a movie that had top-notch production values and also a wonderful soundtrack, but it also had a really good screenplay that a wonderful group of actors were able to work with in order to give us some believable flesh and blood characters for us to get invested in as we watch the events unfold on screen, because I'm sure I've mentioned it before, but you could have a movie that looks good and sounds good, but if the characters are just ho-hum or just barely given any sort of depth whatsoever, you're going to have a movie that, it looks pretty, or it might, make you go, whoa, for a moment, but you're probably not really going to think about it, later. It's the characters that makes the landing stick, so to speak. And Poltergeist is definitely one of those movies where, it looks good, it sounds good, and it is good. And so the fact that there's a rather storied history attached to Poltergeist, that would make a documentary in and of itself. And so I'm not going to say that the making of the movie was more interesting than the movie itself, because the movie itself, it stands on its own, it's okay, it's not subpar in any way, but the making of the movie, should be a movie, in and of itself, or a documentary at least. But it actually started off life as a sci-fi horror film called Night Skies, which was never made, but how it was originally going to be was a collaboration between Spielberg and Hooper and a screenwriter named John Sayles. And Spielberg came up with the genesis of this movie because the film production company that had done his film Close Encounters of the Third Kind was wanting him to do a sequel, and Spielberg had not wanted to do a sequel to that movie, but remembering when he had done Jaws and Universal had done a sequel without him, he wanted to see to it that if they were going to make a sequel to his baby, he was going to be the one to do it and make sure it ran smoothly. So he wanted to do kind of a flip side to the optimistic half of the coin that Close Encounters of the Third Kind was, because Close Encounters was a sort of happy and optimistic perspective of alien visitation on Earth and alien interaction with humanity. But he wanted to do the dark side of that, because one of the things that Steven Spielberg was passionate about was the paranormal, and that includes alien contact or alien abduction. Now, whether or not one actually believes in alien abduction, or visitation, you go down that rabbit hole, you're going to get some scary stories, believe me. And case in point, this one particular encounter was the thing that kind of served as an inspiration for Spielberg, in making this movie. It was called the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter. And I remember reading about that a long time ago, and I don't remember everything about it, but some of the stuff I do remember to this day. There's a reason that particular encounter is seen as kind of like one of the, I guess you could say, classic stories of alien abduction lore, or supposed real life alien abduction or alien invasion lore or encounter lore. And one of the details of that particular encounter was that some of it was a family in a rural area. They had a farmhouse, and one night they were attacked by multiple alien entities, supposedly. And some of these entities were humanoid, but others were smaller and more gremlin-like, was one of the terms that was thrown around. And remember that term, because that's going to come into play in a sec here, or in a little bit here. But, with that in mind, he came up with a general idea of the movie. It'd be, a rural family on a farm, being besieged by hostile aliens. And he had struck up a friendship with Tobe Hooper, because the two of them, it turns out, also they shared a love for the paranormal. But the more they talked about it, though, Hooper was less enthusiastic about the sci-fi side of the story, but was more enthusiastic about the horror angle. And he was throwing around the idea of, well, what if this was a supernatural horror movie as opposed to an extraterrestrial horror movie. And so what ended up happening, amongst other things, was Spielberg, while he was working on Raiders of the Lost Ark, showed the screenplay that John Sayles had written, to a friend of his, and she was particularly moved by this one particular, plot element in the screenplay, wherein there's this one alien amongst these evil aliens that actually turns out to be a good alien, so to speak, and befriends an autistic child that was a part of the family that's being besieged, right? And apparently this element of the screenplay was so well written that it moved this friend of Spielberg's, and Spielberg was kind of like, wait a minute, I could do a friendly alien movie as opposed to a scary alien movie. And mind you, at this point in time, they'd already gotten special effects whiz Rick Baker to start work on designing the aliens. And when he found out that Spielberg was wanting to, basically change things around to where it was a friendly alien movie instead of a scary alien movie, Rick Baker was not thrilled. And there was kind of a falling out there. Excuse me. But then, John Sayles and Spielberg, ended up parting ways amicably once, it became obvious that, Spielberg didn't want to do, a scary alien movie anymore. And so, he would, go on to work on what would end up becoming E.T. the Extraterrestrial. But, this alien horror movie, though, did go on to influence not only E.T., but what would end up becoming Poltergeist, as well as the film Gremlins. Remember, I said that the Gremlins would come into play. The Gremlin aliens would kind of tie into something else, and sure enough, the description of the Gremlin aliens was one of the things that sort of inspired Spielberg, when it came to say, when he was working with, coming up with the story, for Gremlins. And so, I mean, he wasn't the only one who came up with the story, but I'm just saying, like, when he was, remembering stuff, from that particular encounter, the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter, that is something that kind of lingered, So, anyway, what ended up happening was Polter. The horror element that Tobe Hooper was more enthusiastic about with Night Skies ended up becoming its own movie. And in this case, you have a story of, a suburban family being besieged by supernatural forces, not extraterrestrial forces. And so you had a setting change and a change to the nature of the threat. So, and as it should have been, this movie, in my opinion, should have put Tobe Hooper on the A-list of directors, because up until this point in his career, he was kind of an indie filmmaker, who, worked with usually what was oftentimes a low budget, but he had done the, horror masterpiece, which was the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and, is to this day one of the scariest films ever made. And he had also done the first adaptation of Stephen King's Salem's Lot as a TV miniseries. And, to this day, that particular miniseries is regarded not only as one of the best Stephen King adaptations, but one of Tobe Hooper's best works as a director. And he had also done the horror film The Funhouse, and while it's not a masterpiece like, say, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it is a cool little horror film that I would highly recommend checking out. And I am aware that he also did the movie Eaten Alive, but I'm not throwing that in as one of the good movies or good works that he's done. It just wasn't my thing. But those three other works of his, I mean, you see those, and there is no doubt that Tobe Hooper, has what it takes to make a scary film or to, convey an atmosphere of horror. And so, with that in mind, you have a director with that skill being paired with, the mover and shaker that is and was Steven Spielberg. You would think that this would be a collaboration, wherein each of the two were pushing each other to new creative heights, and at the very least, would result in a beneficial boost in the career of whoever worked with Spielberg afterwards. In this case being the focus, being the director. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case because, I mean, this would make another documentary, as I mentioned, earlier. But there's, to this day, a lot of controversy as to, whether or not Tobe Hooper actually directed the movie. And, there's a website called Poltergeist, the fan site, that has, multiple interviews, with, different people that, were involved in the movie. And granted, take what you read with a grain of salt, but some of these have been, proven to be like, from people who really were involved in the movie, like actors or, set people and what have you. And so, basically, Spielberg had wanted to direct this movie, but he was under contract, to where, he couldn't direct more than one movie while he was working on another movie. And so, basically, he ended up, directing, E.T., but he had Tobe Hooper be the director of this movie. And what ended up happening was, depending on who you talk to, either, Tobe Hooper was kind of the dummy director, who was basically, put in place just to make sure Steven Spielberg didn't break contract, but behind the scenes, Spielberg was really, pulling the strings and directing everything, behind, Hooper's back. Or another, take is that, Hooper did direct the movie, but he had a highly collaborative relationship with, Steven Spielberg. And Spielberg, being the mover and shaker, in the industry that he was at the time, and the fact that this was something that he had originally wanted to direct, it would make sense that, Spielberg, wanted to stick with this and make sure that, it turned out to be, a good movie. And so, maybe he got a little too enthusiastic about, making sure the movie was done his way. And, Hooper, by most accounts, is a nice guy, but not necessarily a take charge kind of guy. So, he kind of deferred to, Spielberg's, decisions and judgment and what have you. Like some, actors and, people behind the scenes, in interviews have said that, I mean, in their time working on the movie, some of them remember Tobe Hooper directing them, others remember Steven Spielberg directing them, and others remember, Hooper directed the movie, but he, more often than not, had to go through Steven Spielberg first, and it wasn't done, nothing was done without Steven Spielberg's say. And another possibility is that the whole thing was an innocent, goof that, spun out of control. Namely, there was an instance where Tobe Hooper was working on one shot for the movie, and Steven Spielberg was working on another shot for the movie, just to kind of keep things on track and on schedule, right? And apparently some people from the press had come by to check things out, and they took a few shots of Steven Spielberg directing the scene, and according to Hooper, that was something that took on a life of its own, because people were like, well, wait a minute, I thought Tobe Hooper was directing. What's Spielberg doing directing? And then people were falling all over themselves to say that Spielberg's the real director, and so to this day, I mean, you can get something closer to a straight answer, consider these days, and I think part of that's because with Tobe Hooper having passed away, some people are probably more inclined to kind of throw the dog a bone, so to speak. Like they're more inclined to just straight up say that Tobe Hooper directed the movie, but Spielberg had a lot of pull, but it was a Tobe Hooper film. But on the other hand, I mean, there is the argument that the movie had two directors, Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg, to a point where it should have been credited to both directors as opposed to just one. And so that's something that if you've seen Spielberg's work up to this point, and if you've seen Tobe Hooper's work up to this point, I mean, there's definitely more of a Spielberg feel than a Tobe Hooper feel, but that's not to say that the influence and vibe that Tobe Hooper would bring to his work is altogether absent. It's just that because Spielberg is the mover and shaker, it definitely feels more like a Spielberg film than a Hooper film. But then again, I wasn't there. I don't know how it went down. All I know is what I've read from interviews and what I've seen from people talking about it and what have you. So yeah, I mean, I remember like back in the day, I actually there was a website called ePinions, and I wrote under the handle Real Ponderings. That's REEL, Real Ponderings. And sadly, the site's not there anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. But Poltergeist was a movie that I reviewed, and one of the things I said about it after covering some of the behind-the-scenes info was that I would sincerely like to say that this is, the best movie that Tobe Hooper has made, but with the information about, Spielberg's involvement, in mind, I'd have to settle it for being the best movie with his name on it, so, yeah, make of that what you will. I mean, regardless, this is, a great movie, and Tobe Hooper, definitely, should have had a better outcome, than what ended up happening to his career, partially because of this movie. Because as successful as the movie was, he couldn't really escape, the nagging suspicion that he never directed Poltergeist, or he wasn't the real director of Poltergeist. And it got to a point where, Spielberg actually wrote an open letter, that it was directed to Tobe Hooper, but it was, done in such a way to where, the press could read it too. And, basically it was Spielberg, giving, credit to, Tobe Hooper, saying that, you're the guy who made the film, and basically it's not fair that, the press is saying that you're not the real director. And yes, I was involved in the movie, but, basically you gave me a lot of, room to collaborate with you on this movie, and I wish you, the best of luck in, your next endeavor, because you're a good director. It was kind of like that. But some people, they read the letter, and they're kind of like, that just sounds like damage control. So the debate rages on. Yeah, like I said, the making of the movie, how the movie came to be, what happened. That would make a fascinating documentary in of itself. But as far as the actual movie goes, let's go ahead and get into it. So it takes place in 80s suburbia, and it focuses on this family, called the Freeling family. You had, let's see, Steve and Diane Freeling, who are a husband and wife, and they have 3 kids. You have, Dana, Robbie, and Carol Ann. And, Dana's the oldest of them in high school. Robbie, probably elementary at school at this point. And Carol Ann, she's the youngest of them, right? And, they're a happy family. Diane's, a good mom to the kids, and Steve's a good dad, and he's got a good job at this real estate agency, and he basically, is one of the top salesmen at the place. And they've got this, nice spot in the neighborhood, and, they've got a good relationship with their neighbors. And so all in all, things are going good for them. But Carol Ann, though, as of late, has taken to, going, into the living room or the bedroom, wherever there's a TV on at night, because sometimes what happens is Stephen will be watching TV, in the living room, and he'll fall asleep. And then at a certain time, it goes into almost like shutdown mode. It's like they'll have like the Star Spangled Banner playing, and then it turns to static, right? And that's something that in real life was commonplace with a lot of TV stations and channels. And so what usually happens is the TV will be on, but it's just nothing but static. And so Carol Ann, she'll be waking up, and this is a little girl, mind you, she'll be waking up and going into the living room and going right up to the TV, and she'll start talking to it, and carrying on like a conversation, with it or someone or something in it. And this has happened a couple of times apparently, but the family, the rest of the family, they'll be waking up because they'll hear Carol Ann shouting at the TV, like not in the way that she's scared or anything. It's just, she's shouting, like a little kid would shout, and she's, trying to, make sure the people on the TV can hear her, and she wants to hear them too. But then this starts to take on a creepier tone when one particular night, Steve and Diane are in bed, and their TV, the TV in the bedroom is on, and it's nothing but static. And Carol Ann, comes to, talk to the TV, and she gets closer to it and puts her hands on the screen, and suddenly, like, first she sees like these little flashes of light in the static, like almost like first like little stars or something in the static, like yellow stars, and or are they eyes? And suddenly this ghostly hand just bursts out of the screen. It doesn't destroy the screen, but it just like violently comes out, and it sort of shimmers and twists, and it's hovering in the air and floating, and then it tears its way into the wall above Steve and Diane as they're sleeping, and Carol Ann is just watching all this, just sort of stunned. And once this spectral force finishes going through the wall, the house starts shaking, and this wakes everyone up, obviously. And all the family, they get into the bedroom, and they're like, what's going on? And Carol Ann, she looks from the TV and looks at her family and says, they're here. And the next morning, they're of course, the family's all talking about it, and they're trying to figure out, oh, maybe it was a localized earthquake or something, because like they were trying to figure out if anyone else had experienced anything, but so far they're the only ones who had something like that happen to them that night, as far as they could tell. But then Diane, she's she was talking with Stephen about it, because initially they were just thinking that this is Carol Ann sleepwalking, but after that particular episode, Diane, she's asking Carol Ann, she's like, when you said they're here, who were you talking about? And she says, the TV people. And so she's like kind of unnerved by this, because on one hand it's like, okay, is this just a little kid talking, or is there something going on that I can't quite figure it out at the moment, but I should be able to figure it out, what's going on here. So it goes from that to suddenly some weird shit starts happening. Like that same day, this is while Steven's, at his job, right? And this is just Diane and Carol Ann are the only ones in the house, and their dog. Suddenly, the chairs stack by themselves. Like it's like they move, right? But when Diane's not looking at them, and she's thinking that, okay, the kids must, because this was shortly after, Diane and Robbie had left for school, right? And like the chairs are away from their table, and so she goes in and pushes the chairs back into the table. But every time she comes back to the room, the chairs are moved a little differently. She's like, okay. And once more, she pushes them back, and then and she's thinking, and that second time that happened, she's thinking that Carol Ann was the one who did it, right? And Carol Ann's like, I didn't move the chairs. And so she's holding Carol Ann. She's like, and because she's going to show her the chairs, like, you're telling me you didn't move those? But when she gets to the room, the chairs are stacked on top of each other. Like, we're talking within seconds, okay? And so, Diane, and she's freaked out by this. And she's asking Carol, and she's like, TV people? And she's like, uh-huh. And she's like, are they here right now? And she says, uh-huh. She says, do you see them? Uh-uh. And so yeah, it gets pretty spooky. And one of the other things that happened prior to that was, I mean, shortly before that, Robbie, the Carol Ann's brother, before he left for school, he noticed that his silverware is bent, and he doesn't really know what to make of it, but he has to go to school anyway. So I mean, he's thinking like, I'm not sure what he's thinking, but the look on his face says it all. Because first he was kind of, joking around with his siblings, and then he turns to dig into his cereal, but then he looks at the utensils and they're all just bent, and like, what the? So anyway, that was that's what happened before the chair incident. So Steve comes back home, and Diane, she's kind of like, you gotta see this. And so she shows him a spot in the kitchen that she's put some tape on, and she says, okay, watch Carol Ann. And so she puts Carol Ann on the ground. Carol Ann's just sitting cross-legged, and she has this sort of a skateboard or football helmet on or something, just for grins, right? And Diane's like, watch this. And as they're watching, Carol Ann just moves on her own, from one spot of the kitchen to another, like sliding along the floor while she's just sitting down. And Diane's excited about this, and but Steven's like, what? And he's trying to look on the ground, trying to see if there's something that someone put there, like did some of the construction workers that were working on that were doing some renovations on the outside of the house, maybe they did something, it's kind of like something for the kids or something, and no, nothing there. And so naturally, I mean, he's just kind of dumbfounded at all this, and he's not quite as enthusiastic as Diane is, because she's seeing this and she's unsettled, but at the same time she's really excited because, I mean, there's something happening here, and it seems to be playful more than anything. But one night, though, it goes from playful to downright terrifying. It starts, with a thunderstorm, and it's one that's been approaching throughout this particular day. And of course, I mean, Robbie, I mean, he's kind of spooked by this because, I mean, he's a little kid, and there's not only a thunderstorm outside, but there's a tree that's been where the house is for quite some time now. And as his dad says, it's an old tree. And so Steve's his dad's in there with him, and just trying to calm him down and say, hey, remember the thunderstorms, you count, you go 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, and the further you're able to count, the further away the storm is. And basically just trying to set his kid's mind at ease. And Dana, I mean, she's she doesn't really know a whole lot about what's going on, because, I mean, she's more focused on her life, like, say, with her friends and things like that, and so she doesn't see a whole lot of what's been going on at this point. If she's heard anything, she's just kind of like, yeah, right, but what ends up happening, though, is this storm, it's raging on, and Robbie, he's trying to stick to his dad's advice, and he's counting, but instead of being able to count further, he's only able to count shorter, like, so basically, instead of the storm going away, it's coming closer. And to add insult to injury, the way the lightning is flashing, it's making the tree look, I mean, it was already kind of, you know, unsettling to look at, you know, the way, you know, the way it was like outside of his window and everything, you know, the way the bark was situated, I guess. But with the lighting, though, it actually looks like more like a monster than just a tree. And then suddenly, you know, the tree comes to life, and, you know, basically its limbs, you know, just burst through the window, and you grab, you know, Robbie as he's screaming, and you know, for his you know, family, and it starts to try and eat him. Okay, like it's literally like part of it opens up into like it's like mouth, and it tries to, you know, pull Robbie in, and so, you know, he's, you know, screaming for help, and you know, his parents and Dana, you know, they're running outside, you know, trying to, you know, help Robbie, and you know, Steven's climbing the tree, and you know, fighting with the limbs and to get to Robbie and pull him out, and you know, he's freaking out, and they're able to get him out of the tree, you know, and then suddenly, you know, the tree's just yanked up from the ground, like the storm or whatever, you know, it just pulled it away into the clouds, and you know, and they're just like, what the hell just happened, right? And at that point, Carol Ann, while all this has been going on, these forces, or whatever the TV people are, they abduct her. Okay, like she's just in her bed. I mean, in all the commotion, you know, see, you know, Carol Ann and Robbie, you're like, they share a room together, right? Because like they're just little kids. Okay, and all this commotion, you know, her family, you know, her parents and, you know, her sister were obviously, you know, freaked out and trying to get Robbie out of the tree, right? And you know, they just, all the focus was on him. And you know, while all this was happening, you know, the closet door opens up, and this bright light, you know, starts shining from it. But instead of something benevolent, it's something evil, like something that tries to, you know, pull her into somewhere else. And like, it's like a vacuum, like everything in the room is being pulled into the closet, you know, and where this light's coming from, and she's holding onto the bed rails for dear life, you know, screaming, you know, and you know, for her mommy, and but then she gets pulled in, and you know, they hear her screaming, and they go into the house, you know, to try and find her, because I mean, it's like, yeah, all the commotion, I mean, they kind of, you know, lost track of her because they were trying to get Robbie out of that tree. But you know, they're looking through the house trying to find her, and they're actually thinking that, you know, she may have had another sleepwalking episode, and you know, gone into, you know, the renovations that were being made to make a swimming pool in the backyard, which is like this big mud pit. And you know, Steven, and you know, is, you know, diving into the muddy water, and hoping against hope that, you know, he's not going to find her there, and he doesn't find her, thank God. But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, where is she? And as the family's trying to, you know, avoid going mad with, you know, terror at the situation, and trying to, you know, put their heads together and figure out, you know, what's going on, where is she? And they even look in the closet, you know, and because they see that everything's been, you know, turned around, and I mean, but they don't find her there. They just find, you know, all the stuff in there, you know, like all the toys and everything. And that's when, you know, Robbie starts to hear her voice coming from one of the TVs. And, you know, he starts, you know, screaming out, almost having a nervous breakdown. And he's, you know, calling, you know, mom, mom, mom. And Diane comes running into the room. She's like, Robbie, right, what is it, and she hears Carol Ann's voice too, but it takes her a bit to realize that it's coming from the TV. And so at this point, whoever the TV people are, they've pulled her into their realm. And the family at this point, they're in a full-on nightmare. And so Steve and Diane, they try to consult with this group of paranormal researchers, led by a woman named Dr. Lesh, and she's accompanied by by these two guys named Ryan and Marty. And basically the three of them have actually made a bit of a career after with studying the paranormal and everything. And so Steven's the one who reaches out to them first, and it's like you could tell he hasn't had a good night's sleep in days. Like his eyes are pitted and what have you. He's smoking a lot, and he's telling these researchers what happened, and as far as he could understand it. And he gets them to come to the house to check things out. And so they meet the family and everything, and they're talking and trying to tell him about some stuff that they've witnessed. And one of the guys, Ryan, he's talking about how one time he filmed a toy car move by itself in a space of like say a foot in a matter of like a couple of hours. But mind you, like there was no wind or anything. It was here and it gradually rolls over by itself. And I mean, you can imagine this would be a pretty exciting thing to see for yourself if you're watching it on a camera or something like that, right? And of course Steve and Diane, they're kind of like and they open the door to Carol Ann and Robbie's room, and everything is flying around in there, like all the toys. It's like they've taken on a life of their own almost. And so basically anything these paranormal researchers have witnessed pales in comparison to this. And so now it's their turn to be freaked out. And basically, they stay with the Freelings for to try and further study the situation, and hopefully try and find a way to get Carol Ann out of whatever place this is. And because they find out they find out, courtesy of Diane, that there's a certain channel on the TV that they're able to hear her voice on sometimes. They don't know why, but that's the best channel. And Carol Ann, she actually is able to hear Diane, and and some of the people, like say if Stevens calls to her, she can hear him too. And whenever and in this one particular instance, they're trying to show the paranormal researchers what's going on, and they call to her. Diane calls to her, and she actually feels Carol Ann's soul run through her, and and she's like, oh my God, she just moved through me. And she's in tears, but of joy though, because she knows her daughter's alive. Even if she's not on this plane of existence, she's alive, and she's going to her family and the researchers. She's like, smell her, that's her. And but then they start hearing this thumping that's coming down the stairs, and then this violent force just shakes them, and it pushes everything out of the way, and there's this roaring sound. And so there's something with her in that realm, wherever she is. because she, even before that happened, before that roaring sound, she was saying, there's someone else here, and Carol Ann was saying that, okay? And yeah, at this point, I mean, the experts, they find that, they're a little bit out of their league here, and so they call in a specialist, a psychic named Tangina, who has, apparently had some success in quote unquote cleaning haunted houses. So basically, she's able to make contact with whatever forces are on the other side. And so they call Tangina in, to, make, hopefully, help them out, to where they're able to, get Carol Ann out of this, spectral realm and save her from, whatever it is that's, keeping her there and pursuing her. And so, this was, a great movie. I mean, it's a movie that it kind of lulls you into a false sense of security at first, because, I mean, you have this, nice, John Williams score, that, kind of kicks into gear, at the start of the movie with the credits and everything. And it sounds, all wholesome, and you see all this, lovely image of American suburbia, but then when the scary stuff starts to happening, you are on the edge of your seat. And it's something that I saw when I was younger. I remember, my mom and I went to this Blockbuster that used to be, near us, back when I lived with her, right? And that was one of the movies I rented. And I was surprised, though, because one of my friends in high school, I'm sorry, not in elementary school, okay? This was in elementary school, okay, in the 90s. One of my friends, was telling me how terrifying Poltergeist was. And the way he was talking about it, I mean, he was talking about the tree scene. And he was even talking about a scene where, this one poor guy, hallucinates that he's tearing his face off, which, yes, this happens in a movie, okay? And I'll get to that. But my friend was telling me about how terrifying this movie was. And so, my mom and I, one day, were looking around at Blockbuster, and I find Poltergeist. I'm like, Mom, this is what my friend was talking about. And I show it to her. But then when I see what's rated, I'm like, PG? And because the way my friend was talking about this, I was thinking that surely this was going to be like an R-rated movie or something. But no, Poltergeist was PG. But don't let that deceive you. It's still terrifying, okay? But one of the things that, to me, kind of helps to balance the terror out, or to balance out the terror, is the fact that this family that we come to know, I mean, they're wholesome, but they're believable. It's like there's some bickering and squabbling, with like what you do with a family and everything. But at the same time, there is still like a certain innocence that, this family has. That, I mean, you look at American suburbia, in snapshots and everything, and you imagine these loving families in their homes and everything. And in this movie, I mean, you get to see this. It's not a deconstruction or anything like that, in the sense that some movies would have it to where, I mean, yeah, it's a family in suburbia and it's a nice house, and yeah, they dress nice, but there's all this twisted undercurrent of such and such here, such and such there. And so basically making it to where the happy suburban family is the family from hell or something like that. But no, this isn't that kind of movie. This is where it's like, yeah, this is a happy, loving suburban family, and it's not smarmy, it's not cheesy or anything. Like it's just an everyday family that we see going through a nightmare, okay? And this is kind of like, the older you get, I think the more you're able to appreciate the horror of the situation, because, yes, I mean, there's supernatural shenanigans going on and everything, but this is like child abduction, okay? And so, if you've got a family, and one of your kids or loved ones was abducted, I mean, the terror is real, okay? I mean, you look at true crime stuff, look at interviews and things like that, but now apply that to something where the supernatural is the culprit, okay? What do you do there? And I think that this movie, I mean, this movie does a really good job of, asking that question. What do you do in that situation? What can you do? And so you got the family that, I mean, yeah, they're staying in their house. It's like, where else are they going to go? But, you see how the toll that's taking on them. And obviously, they close off, the kid's bedroom, right? Because that's where all the crazy stuff's happening. That's where it seems to be localized for the most part. That's not to say that, the rest of the house is off limits, because some crazy, spooky shit happens throughout the rest of the house at certain times. But yeah, I mean, you see how it's like, the family, like, they're trying to stay together, they're trying to have each other's back and everything, but it's like they can only go so far, without some help, and so when they get the paranormal researchers to come in, I mean, they at least get a little more insight into the supernatural, as far as, say, what causes poltergeists and what have you. I mean, there's this really, nice scene where, I mean, I should probably just mention, like, the cast in this movie is real good. Before I get into anything else, the cast is wonderful. I mean, you have Jobeth Williams, as Diane Freeling, the mother. You have Craig T. Nelson as Steve, the father, and the late Dominique Dune as older sister Dana, and Oliver Robbins as Robbie Freeling, and last but not least, Heather O'Rourke as Carol Ann. Okay, so all these actors, I know that Jobeth Williams had been in a movie called The Big Chill around this time, but she wasn't like a big, that was like this movie and The Big Chill, I think, were the things that kind of got her noticed, right? And Craig T. Nelson, I don't remember what he'd been in at that point, but, this was something that kind of put him on the map. And, the child actors, or the younger actors, I should say, were wonderful as well. Because, I mean, Dominique Dune, I mean, you see her, I mean, you kind of get what you expect with her character, in a sense that she's an older sibling, kind of, smart aleck, with, like, with her siblings, or, kind of smart, with her parents, but not overly so, like, not to a point where it's like outright, spiteful. It's more like playful. And she's kind of, you get the idea that she might be having some fun on the side with with boys, or or a boyfriend or something, but then when you see her reaction to all the terror that's happening, I mean, when you see her break down, I mean, it's very believable. And I mean, and when she's when she chooses to leave, the home, to stay with some friends, I mean, we understand it, and so does the family too. I mean, they understand, what's going on, because they've been experiencing it. And of course, none of them have ever experienced anything like this before. But they're certainly not going to force, their children to stay in the house if they don't want to, and especially if they don't feel safe there. And of course, poor Robbie, played by Oliver Robbins. I mean, he tries to put a good face on it, but he's just a little kid, and so eventually they send him away, to stay with his, grandparents until all this blows over. And Carol Ann, though, was played by the late Heather O'Rourke, and she was a wonderful child actor. And so you basically have someone who has that sort of E.T. era Drew Barrymore vibe. Someone who's a cute little kid, but at the same time, not, smarmily so. It's more like, it feels like a real, you know, kid would feel like in that kind of environment or that kind of setting, like a suburban setting. But then, her being put through the supernatural horror of it all. It's like, it's interesting because we get to see her acting when she's still in the house and everything, but once she's gone into the other side, we just hear her voice, but that voice gives us a lot to go on. And so, I mean, it's terrifying enough that this poor kid was abducted, right? I mean, that's some very real adult fear right there. But then, the fact that she's being, chased, by something on the other side, something or someone. I mean, it's just downright terrifying, okay? And I just think that all the actors, the actors that played this family, did such a wonderful job of getting us to care about them. And, as a result, I mean, this is a movie that, as scary as it is, and as much as you're on the edge of your seat, you're glued to your seat. You don't want to, even when things, terrify you to where you're like, oh, or, or you're like, you don't want to look at it, you want to cover your eyes, but at the same time, you want to see how this goes because you care about this family. They are a group of real people. That's how good they are. Okay. I mean, yeah, I think you can kind of tell I like this movie. But yeah, but the other actors though, let's see, like you have Beatrice Straight as Dr. Lesh. She's the one in charge of the group of paranormal investigators. I've gotten to like her character over the years. Like the more I've seen this movie, she reminds me of some people I know, right? But like she initially, has this sort of air about her that is a little bit arrogant. This is when the families, when Steve's initially telling her about what's been going on, and of course they think they're professionals in their field, but then once she realizes that, oh crap, this is something that we have never encountered before, excuse me, sorry, but you really see her going from confident and maybe a trifle arrogant to, I am so out of my depth here, but I'm going to do whatever I can to help these, people, because, this is a real danger and they really do, have someone who needs help, they need help too. And you see her, form a friendship, with the family, specifically with Diane. The two of them, become really good friends, and and basically, Dr. Lesh, she assures them that, when like one of her co-workers, one of her fellow paranormal investigators ends up, having, something horrible happen to him and, leaving in terror. Specifically, this one poor dude, hallucinates, in the kitchen one night, that his face, that something happens to his face, and he ends up tearing his own face off, and you see all the blood and gore and everything, and it's terrifying. You see something like that happen, you don't blame the guy for leaving. And so Dr. Lesh, I mean, she's telling Diane that that guy, he's not coming back. But she's telling her this because she's going to go and see if she can find someone to help them. That would be Tangina, the medium. But she assures Diane that she will be back, and there's such a sincerity in her delivery to where you're like, okay, yeah, she'll be back. She's not going to ditch them. And there's a nice scene where Beatrice Straight, she's talking to Robbie, and her character's talking to Robbie and Diane, about what poltergeists are, or what causes them. And she has this, she has the right tone between grandmotherly, because she's talking to Robbie, but she's also making sure she talks in a way that's intelligent enough for an adult to understand. So like Diane can understand it too. And while she does the lion's share of the acting in this particular scene, Robbie, Oliver Robbins, as Robbie, does a good job of playing this little kid who, is learning about poltergeist for the first time. And so it's something that's both, awesome and scary from a little kid's perspective. And of course, Diane, being, the protective mother, is listening along with this, but, she understands the significance and the danger, of what Dr. Lesh is saying, though. And it's just, amongst many other scenes in this movie, I mean, this is one of them where the character, development and the acting really, shines through. But yeah, also, let's see. Yeah, Richard Lawson plays Ryan, one of the other paranormal investigators, and he's the guy who he actually has a couple of moments of comedy. I mean, the comedy in this movie is present here and there, but like once the horror hits the screen, I mean, the comedy's very rare. But his character, though, I mean, has some good moments. Like he's the one who was telling Steve about filming a car moving from one spot to another in the span of a couple of hours by itself, and it's like he has the confidence and arrogance initially that Dr. Lesh has, but once he actually sees all that stuff in the room, he's like, nope. But at the same time, I mean, he's not noping out there. He's more like, okay, this is beyond my pay grade, but it's a job. I'm staying here. It's that kind of vibe, But then, of course, I mean, the other guy, Martin Casella, he plays Marty. Marty's the guy who, unfortunately, has that gruesome hallucination where he's ripping his face off. His character, I thought, I mean, in the amount of time he's in the movie, I thought was pretty believable too. I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, would you want to stick around if you looked in the mirror and you saw your face falling apart in blood and gore and everything? No. Yeah, so I mean, very believable actor when it came to like the horror stuff happening. But yeah, last but not least, Zelda Rubinstein. She's the one who plays Tangina, the medium, the house cleaner, as it were. And she was wonderful in this movie. She's basically like, imagine a kindly grandmother, but one who, views both, the living and the dead with the same amount of compassion. Let's go with the living, like she's wanting to help them come to terms, with, whatever's going on as far as the supernatural goes. And with the dead, she's wanting to, help them to pass on, And one of the things that, happens with her character, once like she gets a reading of the house, as it were, and she's able to actually read some thoughts, that's how good she is, right? I mean, like at one point, Steve, he's, thinking, he's trying to think one thing to throw her off, but then she, she's like, in another room entirely, and she comes back out and says something like, I don't like trick answers. And so it's like, okay, she's the real deal. But, she's talking to the family and the paranormal investigators, that, whatever it was that, has Carol Ann, it's old and it's angry. And somehow it was able to tap into enough power to punch a hole into our world. Okay. And it was, also powerful enough to take Carol Ann, with it into its realm, because, and as far as Carol Ann can tell, this thing is just another child, because it talks to her, like a child would talk to her, but it's manipulating her, because, she says that, like, there's all these people with her, and Tangina is explaining that these are all the people, all the souls who haven't moved on, and this thing, this entity, this force, whatever you want to call it, basically, it's grabbed a hold of all these souls and has refused to let them move on, because it likes the power it has over them. It likes to control. And so, when Carol Ann, when it became aware of Carol Ann, it was like Carol Ann had, this light about her that, basically was almost like as bright as, the light that a soul would go into when it's going to its final destination. And so basically, when it grabbed her and took her into its realm, it's using her to keep all the other souls in line. And once again, Tangina, is saying that, to her, it's just another child, but to us, it's the beast. Okay, and that, to me, was one of the spookiest scenes in the movie. And it's just down to, Zelda Rubinstein as Tangina, talking to the family. Like, she's mainly addressing, Diane, but Jobeth Williams, I mean, she does a good job in the part too, because she's just listening, and, gradually increasing, worry and fear. And when she realizes, just how evil, this force is, it's like she just, tears up in, quiet despair, because, I mean, Tangina, I mean, she does bring some hope with her, but when she when she makes them aware of the scope of what they're up against, I mean, it just makes the horror that much more intense. And the way Zelda Rubinstein just plays a part, I mean, it's kind of like with Beatrice Straight as Dr. Lesh, when she's, telling, Robbie and, Diane what poltergeists are, like Zelda Rubinstein strikes that, balance between, motherly and stern, or grandmotherly and stern, because she's, trying to, bring comfort to the family. And she tells them, your daughter is alive, but she's in great danger, more or less, and so it's like a good balance there. And Zelda Rubinstein sadly passed away a few, I forgot what year it was, but she passed away, so that was a loss, because she was really good in the movie. But yeah, okay, so the special effects in this movie, I mean, we're talking, this is 1982, okay? But the special effects in this movie are amazing. Whether it be objects moving around by themselves, or, spectral lights, floating around, shimmering, or a tree coming to life, I mean, or, poor dude imagining his face falling apart. I mean, it ranges from, spooky but cool to spooky, to just straight up terrifying. And and towards the climax of the movie, you even see some genuinely monstrous forms manifest themselves on this plane of existence. And for the brief amount of time we do see them, I mean, they're terrifying. They're awesome to look at, but they're also terrifying in context of what they represent, because up until that point, the Freelings, the most they'd seen was, objects moving around by themselves, or, hearing stuff, but this, when they actually see, these things, I mean, it's terrifying. Excuse me. But, I mean, there are some moments, though, that I appreciate, because while they're spooky, there is a certain beauty to them. Like there's a scene where they actually see all these ghosts walking down the steps, down the stairs in the house, and the way it's done, I mean, it looks very eerie, like, but not outright menacing, though. And it kind of serves as a reminder that while, yes, there are evil forces at work here that have manipulated events, and that are responsible for Carol Ann's disappearance or kidnapping, we're kind of reminded that not all the ghosts are necessarily evil, but it's just when this force is controlling them, it's kind of like they fall into its sway, and they do whatever it wants them to do. But on the other hand, I mean, how many of them are actually evil, and how many of them are just being manipulated? I mean, that's another question entirely. But that scene, though, to me, it just serves as a reminder that, not all the ghosts are evil. It's just they're lost, and some of them are more susceptible to manipulation than others, I guess. So yeah, I mean, the special effects, like I said, top notch. I think one of my personal favorites is, at the climax, there's this one entity that briefly materializes, and it looks like, I don't know, it's almost like, imagine a skeletal dog, but with, these wings, like the bone structure of wings, and human hair on its head. And this is like a spectral, white figure. But we're talking like the same type of special effects you'd see, or similar special effects you'd see in that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, when the Ark's open and you see all those ghosts and everything. It's kind of like that, but a lot more monstrous. But so yeah, I mean, top-notch, acting by a wonderful cast, amazing special effects that still hold up to this day, at least in my opinion. Some of the special effects, you can tell it's like, okay, this was definitely done in the 80s, but they still look cool. And I'd be remiss to not mention the score by Jerry Goldsmith, because, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it kind of lulls you into a false sense of security, with at the beginning, with the happy picture of American suburbia, but then it gradually becomes more and more ominous, and it's like foreshadowing of something darker to come. And sure enough, when things do happen, I mean, yeah, the score gets pretty spooky. It never loses that sort of whimsical feel exactly, but at the same time, it sort of makes it work along with the horror. I mean, I don't know if I'm describing it in a good way, but it's like, when Jerry Goldsmith's scoring something, there is a bit of whimsy to it. I guess maybe because of nostalgia, but when you put that with horror, we're reminded that we're, on this fantastic journey, but one that is very dangerous, at least as far as, the characters in the movie are concerned, so it's like, it's wondrous for us because we're seeing all these, fantastic things, but at the same time, we're seeing this family being put through hell, okay? And the music, I think, does a good job of conveying that. But yeah, I just, like I said, this is one of my, this is one of my favorite horror films. I don't remember if I said it earlier, but this is one of my favorite horror films. And in my opinion, one of the best put to screen. And I just think that, I mean, it's a great movie, one that you get invested in as far as, the characters on screen are concerned. And, there's some very because of how well the family's fleshed out, and how realistic, the adult fear in the movie is, I think that helps the movie resonate with a lot of audiences a lot more, these days. Because it's like when we're kids, we're watching, oh, cool, it's a scary movie and all that. But as we get older, we're like, oh my God, this really hits home in a lot of ways, But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give, Poltergeist, I'm going to give Poltergeist, the movie, 5 out of 5 stars. This was a great movie, okay? So yeah, as far as special features go, there's a 2-part documentary called They Are Here, The Real World of Poltergeists Revealed. And so the 2 parts are Science of the Spirits and Communing with the Dead. And so I have kind of a mixed feeling I have mixed feelings in regards to this documentary, because the documentary by itself, it's not a bad documentary, and it's very fascinating, especially if you're not all too familiar with the subject of ghost hunting. There's all these reality shows and what have you, but I didn't know a whole lot about ghost hunting, or tapping into the other side, so to speak, or trying to make contact with something. And so it was interesting seeing these people who are supposedly specialists in the field of the paranormal, doing their research and everything. And so, excuse me, sorry. So on one hand, it was cool in that regard, because at least for me, I was seeing something new, like something that I only knew a little bit about, and I got, I guess, a little bit more of an understanding of how they do things in this documentary as far as paranormal researchers go. But at the same time, though, when you see after you've watched the movie and you see all these special effects and everything that are on hand, that are so top notch, you see that, and then you see the documentary that this paranormal, about the paranormal and everything. It's still an interesting documentary, but at the same time, the quote-unquote paranormal stuff we see, is very subdued, and nothing compared to what we've seen in the movie. It's more like, it's been a while since I've seen the documentary, I'll admit, but I remember there's something about when they're using their instruments, like detecting movement or something like that. I think that was if I remember correctly, I think that might be the most that happens as far as anything spooky as far as the documentary goes. So, you're probably going to be disappointed if you're expecting a spectacle with this documentary, because the movie, you get the spectacle, but the documentary is kind of like, okay, humdrum, here we go, still interesting in its own way, but at the same time, kind of a letdown in comparison to what we saw with the movie, Also, I will say that, as interesting as the documentary is, it's kind of a mark against the movie, not the movie itself, but I guess the people who put the DVD together, because it's kind of like, as I've said multiple times here already, the making of this movie would make for a fascinating documentary in and of itself. And whenever this DVD was released, 2007, wow, we're going way back here. I guess the controversy of who really directed Poltergeist, I guess was maybe still too fresh, I guess, and Tobe Hooper was still alive at the time. So I guess, that was still kind of, under wraps, or, certain parties were kind of told not to talk about it. I don't know. But the fact that nothing, pertaining to the making of the movie is on hand here as far as a documentary or anything like that is a disappointment. And so it's kind of like if you want to know more about the movie, you kind of have to, look into it, read up on it, which, I mean, nothing wrong with doing that, but it's just, when you have, such a classic movie that has, such, a storied history behind it, not even being touched on with, the DVD release or physical media release of it, I mean, it is a letdown. And so, yeah, if there's any problem I have, it's not with the movie. It's more so with, say, the DVD. And correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I'm not even sure if the Blu-ray's any better. I don't know if they've ever done a special edition of Poltergeist. I seem to remember that they've done special editions for Poltergeist 2 and 3, but I don't really give a what about those two movies. It's just this was the one for me, so to speak. So it's kind of a bummer that that these sequels that in my opinion were not that good got the royal treatment, but the classic the masterpiece didn't get beans, with the exception of this a decent documentary about the paranormal, just not about the movie. But yeah, in regards to like the controversy, okay, so we've already gotten an abridged version of who directed Poltergeist. I mean, there's still a lot of debate to this day, and with the passing of Tobe Hooper, some of the people involved in the movie, more or less, I think, have either been more vocal about him being the director, or maybe they've been more inclined to say, okay, I mean, yeah, it was a collaboration between Hooper and Spielberg, but we'll go ahead and give it to Hooper. It kind of depends on how you read into these things. And so whether or not, Hooper full on directed this movie, this is definitely, one of his best movies. Okay. I will definitely stick with the whole, this is the best movie with his name on it. I would even argue that with respect to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Poltergeist, I think, is better than that. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a masterpiece in and of itself as a horror movie, okay? But I think Poltergeist was better because, it had this universal appeal to it. Whereas with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there was certainly a lot of more nuance than you'd expect with that movie. If you look into, the stuff that, they were, touching on in that movie. But here, though, it's just a lot more relatable because of the family perspective, And I will say that, while this does feel more like a Spielberg movie than a Hooper movie, if you've seen, like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even the so-so movie Eaten Alive, I know it has its fans. I'm not necessarily one of them, or even if you've seen Salem's Lot or The Funhouse. I mean, if you've seen his movies up until this point, if you know what to look for, you can kind of feel Tobe Hooper's presence here, because his movies, for the most part, they seem to touch on, I guess you could say, a more naive or innocent, group of people in America running afoul of something that, is in the deepest, darkest recesses of America. So, like, innocent, innocent America, coming face first, with the nightmare that's beneath it all, and you read up on some of the themes in his work, and you can definitely see that it being consistent. But here, though, I mean, it's instead of having an American family going to someplace and being confronted with the horror, here the horror comes to them. But then again, there's also certain plot developments that call into question, what if or they ask the question, what if the horror was here all along? And I'm not going to elaborate on that, but you see the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. But at the same time, though, I mean, you have the idea of this, in this case, an innocent American family coming face to face with, the darkness beneath everything. And here, it's kind of like, I mean, there is this, thematic link to his other movies in the sense that you're seeing like a dark side of America in some ways, being brought out or being, shown to, I guess you could say it's more innocent characters here, but in the other movies, I think it was a lot more obvious as far as, having, the characters go, from safety, to horror, whereas here the horror comes to where the characters are supposed to be safe, and so innocent American suburbia isn't so safe anymore. But yeah, I just like I said, if you've seen Tobe Hooper's work up until this point and Steven Spielberg's work up to this point, it does feel more Spielberg than Hooper, but at the same time, Hooper's influence and his vibe that you would pick up from his other movies up to this point, you can still pick up on it. You can still feel it. So yeah, Poltergeist, great movie. 5 out of 5 stars. If you made it this far, thank you very much for sticking with me. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. Y'all take care. Oh, wait a minute. Before I say goodbye, I will mention that the bit about certain cast members meeting with unfortunate ends. The specifics are Dominique Dunne, who played Dana, the older sister of the family. She was actually murdered by an ex-boyfriend of hers. And if I remember correctly, it was shortly after this movie was released. And so yeah, that was an unfortunate end right there. And if I remember correctly, this was like her first real movie too. And she was supposed to have a part in the movie V, which in turn became a TV show back in the 80s. And she was supposed to have a part in there, but because she was murdered, her character was written out. And I think I heard there was like one scene where you might see like the back of her or something, but the movie V was, if I remember correctly, was actually dedicated to her memory. So, but yeah, Dominique Dunne, yeah, she was murdered shortly after this movie by an ex-boyfriend. And Heather O'Rourke, she died. She was really young. She was like, I want to say she was like 12 or 13 or something, but she died because of some kind of poisoning she'd gotten from like a family well, like water from a family well, and got some sort of infection from it, and there was like, I think it's called stenosis or something, but she ended up getting like toxic shock from it, a septic shock, I think that they called it, and died from it. And so yeah, a little kid dying like that, I mean, that was sad to find out about. And one of the other cast members, I forgot exactly which one it was, but I think it was someone who played one of the construction people in the movie, because like there was a lot of construction people that they show at one part in the movie, doing renovations in the backyard. One of those construction guys, by the way, was the late Sonny Landham, the guy from, he played Billy in Predator. So he had a bit part as one of the construction workers. But this other construction worker, though, or this other actor who played one of the construction workers, I forgot which one it was, but he was actually, I think he was murdered like several years later, so it wasn't like he was murdered, when this movie came out. It was like years after the fact. But at the same time, you know, when people found out, hey, he was in Poltergeist, they're like, hey, Poltergeist curse, you know. And two of the actors that were in Poltergeist 2, The Other Side, one of them was actually dying of cancer, and he played I think his name was Julian Beck or something. He played the bad guy. And this other actor, it was a Native American actor, I forgot his name, but I think he died of cancer too. So there you go. But so yeah, that's one of the things, you know, that adds fuel to the fire when people talk about there being a poltergeist curse. So I hope there's not. So knock on wood, right? But yeah, so anyway, that was the last tidbit of information. But if you made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. And y'all got any questions, comments, drop a line, let me know. And y'all have a good night. Take care. Bye.